Okay, Alan, you talked about it being a key issue for the mining industry. A lot of experience with sitting on the board, obviously, of Hibben Minerals. Why don't I turn it over to you to talk about some of the challenges and the history of social license there?
Sure. Well, I think social license, as I said before, was coined by a miner, and it is a concept that we've had to deal with well before Jim Cooney actually coined the phrase in 1997. Mining companies have had to deal with a license to develop, a license to operate. Interestingly, the mining business is a very long gestation business. It takes 8 to 10 years from finding a resource to actually developing it. And mining is a very highly regulated industry. People may not recognize it as it is, but everything from permits to develop, to operate, and remediation, mining companies have become very good at anticipating where they need to be with respect to regulation and managing their business so that they can get the approval of governments. The interesting thing about social license, and we've talked about it a bit before, is that it's not enough. Obviously, as a mining company, to just do what's required from a regulatory point of view. It's not even enough to do what's required from an overall reputation management point of view. You really do operate in mines at the pleasure of local communities. And as I said before, in terms of the defining social license, the definition of local community has expanded dramatically over the course of the last few decades to include stakeholders that we might not have thought were actually stakeholders 10 years ago. One of the reasons that it's become even more important for mining companies in the last few years is that mines are having to go further and further away. So the typical mine these days is operating in a pristine environment, where obviously there's substantial environmental risk, either for air quality or disruption, remediation, and particularly water quality, which is a big issue with mines. But the second point is that we're often operating in areas where there are indigenous populations. It's not just in Canada where we have this sort of issue. All through South America, for example, indigenous populations are very disadvantaged, really not cared for particularly well by their federal or local governments, and are being disrupted on the one hand and offered development opportunities on the other. So we have a very big impact on a local community. We have an impact for good in the sense that we are providing jobs and development opportunities, and as Valerie said, even co-investment opportunities on occasion. But also we have that potential for environmental damage, potential for disrupting a traditional way of life. And local communities who really do provide a support, or they can provide a complete restriction to your ability to operate, are really two minds about development themselves. So we are walking down a very difficult line when we're developing and operating a mine in these pristine environments. Just in Canada, there's another issue it was even more difficult, and you would have heard about the duty to consult, and that was a case that came in front of the Supreme Court that effectively required the federal government to consult with Aboriginal groups with respect to operations on traditional lands, whether or not there was a land claim that had been settled or not. Interestingly, in Canada and even to some extent in Peru, where Hibben operates, that duty to consult is now not regulation, not law, but is expected by governments. And it's really subcontracted to mining companies to be able to have those sorts of consultations and make sure that local communities are on side. However, and this is an interesting thing about both social media and the expansion of interest groups, I think, as I mentioned before, there's some 40,000 NGOs worldwide. Each country has many hundreds of thousands of NGOs. And so while at one point we would have thought of the local community as someone who might have been within 20 miles of our mine or downstream from a river that was there, we're now having to think about stakeholder groups that are much, much wider. It's not just environment, it's not traditional way of life only. It can be safety, which obviously is job number one for a mining company, but it can also be things like corruption or the sharing of development benefits amongst populations. So that is a real change for us. And in addition, those NGOs have money. So the interesting thing is that the power of a local community has now been expanded, both because they can obtain financing to be able to put their case in front of the mining company and local government, but in addition, those NGOs are very, very good at using social media, and in many cases much better than a mining company is going to be, and that kind of pressure that can come indirectly on a government or even directly on a government from a well-financed, well-advised local community can be very, very difficult for a mining company. Our job, obviously, is to try and balance the interests of building the mine, making money, and operating in the most responsible way that we possibly can. Valerie mentioned towards sustainable mining, which is obviously a good thing. But I'd counter her point is that sometimes towards sustainable mining isn't even enough. Mm-hmm. And you can be in situations where not only are the local community and the NGOs against you from the point of view of the way that you actually manage your business, they may be against your business entirely. The whole argument around Keystone is not really about pipeline safety. People would like you to think that it is. It's actually about destroying the business of mining heavy oil. So that's something where you may not be able to have the kind of negotiation that you want. I think it's obviously a management issue, and it's obviously a governance issue. One point that I would like to make and make sure that people understand is that there are legal boundaries to what you can do. And one of the issues around social license that directors really need to focus their minds on, particularly in the mining area, is in this sharing of benefits. You'll often hear it, governments support it. It is a way of making development happen within local communities. One thing that I've been, I guess, schooled by New York lawyers is you should be very careful about the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. When we're talking about the sharing of benefits, it's very easy to go over the edge into things that perhaps a company should not do. So how should a company organize? How do mining companies organize for social license? I think coming back to a point that Don talked about, it's obviously on the top of the risk register, and so we do that from the point of view of having individual people within the organization, high in the organization, responsible for sustainability, environment, health, safety, and as well the overall position on social license. There is often, if not always, in mining companies, a board committee that has responsibility for making sure that that social license ends up at the top of the board agenda. At Hudbay, we have a Environment, Health, Safety, and Sustainability Committee that of board members that meets often, and it reviews every project that we're involved with for the impact on the local community. One thing, and I think this also goes to points that Valerie made, mining companies have to do a better job of listening. We like to think, as I said, our local community is within 10 miles of us, but our local community is now grown, and social media is the method in which communities get organized against mining companies, against development. Mining companies have not really thought of themselves as being social media companies. We don't have a customer base that we can talk to, but it's extremely important that mining companies have a social media strategy, that we have people that can monitor what are the issues that are emerging, not just the issues that are emerging from the local community, but issues that might emerge from a broader NGO group that could have an effect on our business. For example, there is the fair tax group at the moment. So while you might not think about mining as having that as a constituency, it certainly does, because we organize ourselves, as normally companies do, to pay a minimum amount of tax. But we're also looking over our shoulder at the fair tax group to see what should we be doing from a public perspective there. So how do we organize? Internally, it should have high profile. The person in charge of social licenses and sustainability should report directly to the CEO and should be supported by a board committee. I think it's, in a mining company, it's very important from a project perspective too. A little story from our project in Constancia, which is in Peru. We're moving 36 families. In Peru, you're not allowed to move them involuntarily, so each of those families has an interest, and we have to accommodate that. We have a plan for each individual family as to what's going to happen, and that was part of the project budget, the project structure, because it's part of the critical path of developing the mine. So when we're looking at a project plan, we're looking at a budget. Ours happens to be 1.7 billion. There is a significant amount of time, attention, and I'll admit, money that's involved in making sure that we have that license to operate, because the local governments and even the Canadian government is looking at us to do the right thing, and that's all something that really has to be at the top end of the board agenda.